So Dodi, what is that you're listening to?
Well, it's actually a video I'm watching of my childhood hero.
Oh, how sweet. And who might that be?
That is the ballerina Meryl Ashley. Because, I bring up ballet as often as possible into every conversation.
Well, I think a background in ballet, the precision and so on, the artistry of it lends itself well to this kind of work.
Did you know what you wanted to be when you were a kid?
I totally knew what I wanted to be. I actually wanted to be a milkman because I thought that the electric milk floats, which is what the milkmen drive in England, was the coolest thing ever. But
always the visionary, Connor.
It was it. I saw these milk floats. I thought, that's the future. That's what I want to be.
So, well, both you and I then, we had our plan A when we were kids that have obviously become something different. Recently, I was talking to one of our colleagues who actually has become her plan A. Since her childhood, she was fascinated with viruses.
So in what kind of way? Like kind of chicken pox and catching viruses, mumps and so on?
How viruses work and what they are good at. I think we should find out more about this.
So I guess this is what matters on today's episode.
Viruses and vaccines.
So who was this that talked so eloquently about viruses to you?
Hi, I'm Daria Donati. I've been working first with cell therapies, so a new way of vaccinate in my first PhD, and then moved on more in infectious diseases and trying to find ways to prevent infections through vaccination. That's why I'm so interested into that.
Okay, so vaccines, and when we typically think about that, obviously now we're thinking a lot about that, but it's a shot in the arm or the buttock and so on.
Vaccine, it's a way to educate our immune system to recognize foreign and dangerous stuff. That can be viruses, that can be bacteria. So for me, vaccination is just a tool to give to our body to be able to front whatever can happen around us. The interesting thing in the immune system is that you can vaccinate people for many different types of diseases. Your immune system is just there to learn. It's like when you tell people that children can learn many different languages until they are 8 years old. They're not only able to learn one, but even up to 10. And why? You just need to expose them to that. And that's the same with the immune system. The difference is that they cannot only learn 10 different ways of recognize diseases, but many, many, many more. Actually, we don't know what is the upper limit. So vaccination is a great tool to be able to do that.
So you could say our immunizations are a way of teaching the immune system. So even for the immune system, every day can be a school day.
Definitely. And that's why I spend most part of my life, working on immunology and trying to see how our immune system can be educated.
Daria knows her stuff, and she explained to me the incredibly difficult and time-consuming process of bringing a vaccine to market.
Everything starts with trying to find the right molecule or technology that you can actually use as a vaccine tool. That per se, it's a very complicated process, probably one of the most complex in the biopharma world. It takes much shorter time to develop a generic biopharma product than the vaccine product. To bring a vaccine that is already discovered, let's say, a known molecule to market for vaccines, it takes up to 10 years. There are many different reasons for that. And one major one is, just think about that. If you have a terminal disease and you need to be treated, you are a sick person and the treatment is perhaps your last chance. So what do? You don't fear to be exposed to a new treatment, and you go in, with peace of mind trying to see if you have an opportunity to get cured. When you test vaccines, you test them on healthy people. So if you can test a generic biopharma drug on a cohort, a group of people that is, let's say, 200, 300, in rare cases, even 20 people, when you test vaccines, you usually use very large cohorts, that is thousands of people.
So if it takes between 10, 15 years to get a vaccine to market, and of course now we're in the midst of the COVID-19 coronavirus epidemic, which is oddly ironic given that we've had this episode in the pipe for a good while. How is the industry looking to kind of accelerate that process, shrink that 10-year timeline down to, well, in this case, months? Can it be done?
So in theory, it can be done.
We have been struggling in the industry trying to reduce the time to market more and more. And in the past years, many companies have developed new technologies that would allow the vaccine to be sort of flexible. What does it mean? A vaccine system, technology, and I would make an example, the one of viral vectors, and I can tell you a little bit about what is it, but that can be used specifically toward a certain type of target pathogen. There would be a disease in larger layman terms, but can be used as well to defeat another similar or not similar pathogen. How do you do that? Basically, in the case of viral vectors, you have a carrier, a little car, where you insert genes that are very specific for an antigen that is essential to induce an immune response against a specific virus. What about if I'm in a condition incapable of changing the same genes expressed, but use the same carrier to be able to express an antigen that will target another type of disease? In this case, what we have been trying to do, we have been trying to develop platform of technologies that could, with the time, address different type of diseases with the same background. So it's easier to go into the speed of development and manufacturing.
So I suppose it can be done, and that's terrific, but should it be done faster on a regular basis for more what you might call normal vaccines, or is there a good reason for there actually being a really long time frame for it to take to develop these vaccines?
There are very good reasons for a longer time frames, and then we go back to the fact that vaccines are actually injected in healthy people. So I think the regulatory authorities have a very good reason to scrutinize very carefully. At the same time, I think they are demonstrating the willingness to evaluate these stringent regulatory requirements when it's time to respond to emergencies. And I think it is a dichotomy that really speaks really for a good approach to that.
Okay, Conor, like you said earlier, we are right now in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis. We don't want to delve too much into the specifics there because that situation is changing every day. But we do want to track back to the history of vaccines and just understand that better so that we can get more insight into what Daria was talking about. So we got a hold of this guy.
I'm Adrian Hill. I'm the director of an institute here at the University of Oxford in England, and I'm particularly involved with vaccines. In fact, our institute is called the Jenner Institute after Edward Jenner, who was effectively the discoverer, if you like, or the founder of vaccination, way back in 1796. Many years ago, in the 18th century, when the first vaccine was discovered, Jenner noted that milkmaids never got smallpox. So thinking on from that, he figured out that if he could take some of the smallpox fluid from a lesion on a milkmaid's hand and inoculate that into somebody else, that they might be protected against getting smallpox. And lo and behold, that worked first time. He was lucky. He didn't know what a virus was. He didn't really understand what he was doing, but he produced something which was of enormous public health impact in a very short period of time. So within 5 years, his vaccine was being used not just in England, but throughout Europe, in India, in Russia, and even in the United States. That would be very rapid today, let alone in 1796.
So to oversimplify that story, Edward Jenner accidentally figured this out.
That's right.
And I started wondering if that is, if that's the normal way to discover vaccine. Are things happening by accident, or have we then developed a much more determined and predictable process? Adrian actually answers that question.
It's a much more scientific process with a lot more scientific understanding of what is going on, particularly in terms of the immune response that's produced by vaccines, but also in terms of the molecular and atomic structure of vaccines. So we these days literally design vaccines at the atomic level, asking if this is the molecule we want to make an immune response against. Would it be better if we took out this part of the sequence, if we glued together at the atomic level particular domains of the protein and tried to ensure the structure was fixed? So that's now a standard part of molecular vaccinology. So that's good news, of course. What's bad news is that it takes a lot longer and it's much more expensive. And there are people in large pharma companies who will tell you that you can do nothing with £100 million to make a vaccine. You need an awful lot more than that, and you need 10 or 15 years on average. And sadly, they're generally right. And one of the great topics of discussion today and these days is whether we can do this much less expensively, much more quickly. And that's been driven by the outbreaks that the world has suffered over the last 10 or 15 years, from swine flu to particularly Ebola. That was a great wake-up call back in 2014, to what we're experiencing as I speak, which is a growing global epidemic of coronavirus, a coronavirus we didn't know existed last December. And yet people, probably 20 different groups around the world, are rushing to try and make a coronavirus vaccine in the next few months. A vaccine in a year's time or in 2 years' time is probably no use. We need something much more quickly than that. And we might need billions rather than millions of doses of that vaccine.
So what does Adrian see happening in the future of vaccines?
More and more, we're going to be using and deploying therapeutic vaccines to treat diseases. So there are vaccines in clinical trials to treat blood pressure, to treat high cholesterol, famously to treat Alzheimer's disease. That's proving fairly difficult, but also to treat other immunological diseases like psoriasis and allergies. And these are making very rapid progress, and I have no doubt that those vaccines are going to be licensed in the next few years. And probably some of the biggest public health gains, certainly for older individuals, will be through this new approach of vaccinating to often treat rather than necessarily cure chronic disease. I'm convinced that this is the direction vaccinology will be moving in more and more over the next 20 years.
Right. So after talking to Adrian and Daria, I thought, great, that's going to be a fantastic episode about viruses and vaccines. And then I happened to be on an airplane, because this was weeks ago, before all of the COVID-19 crisis that we are currently going through. And I happened to overhear somebody who was talking about how she is a doctor of infectious diseases, and she was on her way to a convention. She was on her way to a big gathering of people to talk about viruses and vaccines. And I just had to interview her too.
I'll have to be honest. This was not something that was planned.
So who is this? Who did you meet on the plane?
My name is Rebecca Chandler, and I am an infectious diseases physician turned pharmacovigilante. I come from the States, but I met my husband who, well, he's German. It still doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, I needed to get to Europe, and particularly to Sweden, because he had gotten his PhD here. And I didn't know any Swedish, but I applied for a job at the Swedish Medical Products Agency because they needed an infectious diseases doctor. And I got it by some miracle. And to be honest, the plan was work there, learn Swedish, get your license, and then go back to the hospital and take care of patients, because I'm a real people person. I mean, I love to talk to people. I love to hear their stories. What I didn't really anticipate was how I would fall in love with this discipline called pharmacovigilance, which is really the overarching term for what I do.
She is a pharmacovigilante. Isn't that the coolest sounding superhero you've ever heard of?
That is extraordinary. So let her explain exactly to us what pharmacovigilance is and why it's important.
I spend my days monitoring the safety of medicines and vaccines and other medicinal products. And I think, though, it makes perfect sense that I love it because so much of what I do is very similar to infectious diseases, particularly infectious diseases epidemiology. I consider a safety concern, a safety signal, like narcolepsy. It's like an outbreak of an adverse event. It's very similar to an outbreak of a disease. So it's something you don't expect. It's in a cluster of people, and you've got to figure out why did it happen, what caused it. And so the parallels are uncanny, I think. I think that's why I love pharmacovigilance in particular. I chose this field almost 20 years ago. And even back then, people thought, we're not going to need infectious diseases doctors so much anymore because we've figured everything out and it's just so funny that even in 20 years, how many infectious disease emergencies, if you want to call it, have happened. We've had monkeypox, we've had SARS, we've had MERS, now we've had coronavirus, we've had Ebola. I love it too because it's such a social science too, because infectious diseases are tied so closely to the way people behave and how they live.
And Rebecca mentioned adverse events and narcolepsy, so I asked her to take us back. In 2008, Rebecca started working at the Swedish Medical Products Agency as a safety assessor.
A year into the job, we had the experience with pandemics and the safety signal of narcolepsy.
One rare, and we should emphasize rare, side effect of flu vaccines is starting to show up around the country. Our Dr. Jennifer Ashton is here to tell us all about it. Good morning.
Good morning, Harry. It is rare. This is a pretty rare illness known as Guillain-Barré syndrome.
In 2009, there were a whole lot of young people who started to suffer from narcolepsy out of nowhere, and some doctors started describing it as an epidemic.
And did they get to the bottom of what was causing it? I mean, it's a long time ago, so
there was a vaccine which had been approved for use for H1N1. It had been accelerated through clinical trials, and the manufacturer was given an indemnity by the UK government. 850,000 vaccinations. Think about the scale of that, 850,000 vaccinations. So children who were 6 months old up to 16 years were getting this vaccination. Then, after the pandemic in 2010, 2011, what happened, and this is interesting, is that this vaccine that was used for H1N1 was used in place of the seasonal flu vaccine on a further 170,000 adults and children. And then doctors noticed an increased incidence of narcolepsy. So they did a study, and they found that 1 in every 55,000 of these vaccines was associated with this adverse development.
So of all the people that had been given the vaccine, 1 in every 55,000 of those people had some association with narcolepsy. It doesn't sound like a lot, 1 in 55,000, but it's more than you would really accept as an adverse event in a mass vaccination campaign.
So Rebecca takes that up again.
That really changed my life. As an infectious diseases physician turned regulator, it was very interesting to go from a situation where we think about vaccines all the time as an infectious diseases doctor, as one of the greatest medical interventions possible, which they are, but to have an experience where we see that there are instances of harm. That was a turning point for my career, to really spend my life trying to understand why do vaccines cause harm in the few people that they do.
So I think it's important to note that what we come away with is that it is so important to consider safety, and that developing vaccines is overall better than not having a vaccine.
So just in case anyone thinks that we're going anywhere near anything that remotely smells like a debate about the value of vaccination, vaccination is the single biggest, most important health intervention that you can make in a population's health. So let's not be coy about that, right?
Utterly. And it's a huge issue. And so somebody like Rebecca has to consider on a daily basis, How does she prioritize what to look at?
Typically, when regulators will need to focus on a vaccine or a drug or a public health issue, we will prioritize based on the newness of the product. I just spent a couple of days reviewing all the reports in our global database for a new malaria vaccine that they're piloting in 3 countries of Africa. So that comes under quite close review. You can prioritize by the drug or the vaccine, but you can also prioritize by the event. You might want to look in your database for all serious adverse events. So when we talk about a harm from a drug or a vaccine, they're usually classified as non-serious or serious. But a serious event would be one, that resulted in hospitalization or caused a death or a congenital malformality. So you might prioritize how to look at harms based on the seriousness of the event.
So that's how Rebecca considers what's important. And I think, Conor, this is what brings us back to what we were talking about at the beginning here. Considering viruses and vaccinations, really, you have to be an artist. You have to be a ballerina. Somebody like Rebecca, somebody like Adrian, somebody like Daria, they are training day in, day out, constantly learning more about viruses, constantly trying to develop vaccines. And there's always something better around the corner. And it is a never-ending process of being a great artist.
Okay, so I get it. So it's about putting in the hard work that makes you good at what you do. It's about dedication and commitment to a cause which kind of subsumes your entire life.
And then you get on stage, and also it's like in the moment. It either happens or it doesn't.
Flow states coming to you soon. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.
Rate us
and recommend us to your friends and colleagues, and we'll see you next time.
Stay safe. Wash your hands.